Thank you everyone for coming. This is the Knowledge Worker Innovation Series. It's our second event, and the topic today is Mastering Digital Transformation. Thomson Reuters brings in thought leaders from industry and academia to discuss and explore technology and business topics and bring together our wonderful neighborhood in the innovation district between innovators and entrepreneurs. So today it's my pleasure to introduce George Westerman. George is a research scientist at the MIT Center for Digital Business. He's also a faculty chair for the MIT Sloan Executive Course. And George's research examined the role of executive leaders in driving competitive advantage from digital technology. George is co-author of 2 award-winning books in IT and is actually working on one in the topic we're going to discuss today. And prior to joining MIT, George has 13 years of experience in innovation technology, and he holds a doctorate from Harvard Business School. So join me in welcoming George.
Hi, everybody.
All right, so George, how did you get started on this work?
Well, so about 3 years ago, my colleagues and I and our research sponsor, Capgemini, were thinking about the same problem, which is that there was a lot of talk out there about social, about mobile, about analytics. But it was always the same companies. They were the startups, or they were these special technology companies. Unfortunately, most of the companies we knew were not in the press, and that seemed odd. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to go out and say, all these things that these technologies companies are doing, what are the big billion-dollar boring companies doing? And we actually went out and tried to find, let's find boring companies doing exciting things. And that's how we got into this project.
So were you looking at technology companies only, or from other industries as well?
We were looking at manufacturers, pharma, financial services, these kinds of companies. If you think that a lot of the technology companies and startups, they may be at most 10% of the economy. We wanted to look at the other 90%. But then what we learned about the other 90% also applies to the startups and those kinds of things, because you want to work with these big companies.
Okay, so can you share with us what were your findings and what kind of framework you derived from that work?
So we found that not only are companies doing really interesting things with this technology, but some are doing better than others. And so there's a class we call digital masters. There are about 25% of the companies out there that we studied. They are doing digital a certain way, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but they're also outperforming their peers by 26% in terms of profitability.
So let me ask you this. So you find that across non-technology and technology companies, for large companies over $1 billion, is that what you said? Mm-hmm. There are some that outperform their peers. So what makes them better?
Well, it's interesting. We saw 2 kind of dimensions of activity in digital. One is just the digital activities. So the really cool social marketing activities, or location-based marketing, or autonomous vehicles, these kinds of things. We saw that's kind of one dimension we call digital capability. But there's another dimension which is really interesting. It's what we call leadership capability. It's not doing the digital stuff, but it's using the digital to transform the way your company operates. And so if you think about these 2 dimensions, the digital and the leadership, you get a 2x2. And the people at the top of that 2x2 are these digital masters. They not only are doing better digital stuff, they're leading it better, and that's how they're getting this advantage.
So when you looked at this 2x2, right, you have the way people are employing a set of digital tools, and then the way they have a leadership around it.
Yeah.
Which one matters the most?
Well, it's interesting, but the leadership seems to matter the most. Because the digital, so imagine the people at the one side of the 2x2 that are doing more digital but not the leadership. We call them fashionistas. And plenty of fashionistas. They look really good on the outside, not always a lot kind of behind the scenes. And that's what we saw. The people that are doing the digital without the leadership they might have 3 different collaboration platforms that can't talk to each other. They might have 4 different ways to do marketing, online marketing or mobile marketing with their customers, but it's not integrated. Those are the fashionistas. It seems like the leadership is more important. The leadership, if you have that in place, you can do the great digital. It's a whole lot harder to do all the digital and then have to pull it together into some kind of integrated whole.
Can you describe a little bit what are the attributes of leadership that you research and what are they in this?
Sure, yeah. So it starts really, let me just say first of all that for all the talk we've heard in social media and innovation about letting 1,000 flowers bloom, We didn't see any examples of that happening successfully. We saw a lot of flowers bloom and then die. But the ones that were successful started from top down. They led this from the very top of their organizations. They started with a strong vision for how are you going to be different because you're digital. They then put in engagement to help everybody buy into the vision, and very strong governance to make sure that you moved in the direction of the vision and not in the wrong direction. And those three together, the vision, the engagement, and the governance, are really what we call this leadership capability. And that's really what drives the change.
That's really interesting. So, okay, so I want to get started on becoming a digital master. How do I begin?
Well, so you can go either way. You can either go start with the digital stuff and then move over to the leadership. But like I said, I think it's a lot better if you can start with the leadership and then go digital, because you're a lot smarter how you spend. So what I would do first is try to figure out what is your vision for where you're going, why you're going to be different digitally. And I'll give you an example in accepting. And then once you got that vision, start to have people buy into it. So just for an example, Angela Ahrens at Burberry. Her company Burberry's a big retailer. They've been doing fashion for 100 years. They were growing 1% to 2% per year when all their competitors were growing 12 to 13%. Now, when she looked at and said, what are we going to do? She realized that, first of all, they were going after a market that everybody was going after. It was a really red ocean going after these ladies who lunch. And you know the ladies who lunch, right? They're the people that can afford Burberry and all the fancy stuff. They said, let's go for somebody else. Where else can we find wealthy people who are a different demographic? And they realized there's a lot of people in the millennial generation who, especially in Asia, but also over here, they were a tremendously new market. So she went after the millennials, and that meant she had to speak the digital language, which was the language of digital. So that's kind of how they got started. And her vision was digital end-to-end, digital across channels. They did things like, first of all, if you go into their stores, now it's a completely different look from the way it used to be. But also you got people walking around with iPads to help you. You got all kinds of digital displays. But in addition, they did something fun. Instead of fashion shows on catwalks, they also would do, for example, a tweet walk. They'd release some fashions on Twitter and social media first, and then they'd show up on the catwalks later. And it's all about trying to tie into that different demographic with digital.
So I think it'd be cool to see an example from an industry we think usually as not digitally enabled. Do you have one like that?
Yeah, so how about government-owned copper mining companies? Think about, could you think of a slower moving industry? But Codelco, owned by the state of Chile, is the world's biggest copper mining company. And they're doing really interesting things. You just never see them because they're all behind the scenes. So about 10 years ago they started. They wanted to just put some automation in. They had Codelco 1.0, and the CIO actually did this to help develop a vision that everybody could build around. But from basic automation, then they started saying, what can we do with our machines? Have you guys ever seen a mining truck? It's like the size of this room. The wheels are like taller than I am. And like if you were ever a 6-year-old boy, these things are just great. But these trucks now drive around the mines autonomously. And when you take the driver out of the truck, it gets where it's supposed to go on time, and it never runs over anybody. So that's really kind of cool. And now what they're doing with this, now they've got good telemetry and information on the mines. They've got autonomous vehicles. That's Codelco 2.0. They're looking at Codelco 3.0, which means they will never, if they can get fully automatic, they would never need to send anybody underground again. You would never have miners trapped under there. And on top of that, if you never have to send anybody underground, you can build your mines more cheaply, and you got a better economic story for all the copper ore you're going after. So they started with this vision of just getting more automated. They then tried something else, and now they're going to get to where they're going to transform their entire industry.
Wow. So I think the model you're describing is for all these big companies that are typically over $1 billion. Is there any insight you gathered from your research that can be applied to startups, or what can startups take away from your research, since we're in this neighborhood with a lot of innovators in that ecosystem?
This is really important for startups for a couple of reasons. First of all, I know when you talk about billion-dollar companies, a lot of startups kind of shut down. They just say, this isn't me. But I think there are two opportunities. One is because this leadership side is so important and that vision side is so important, startups already have it, where bigger companies need to develop this and run it across. So one of the things is, if you're a startup, you probably know digital better than the large companies do, and you have an opportunity to go after a piece of the digital story, whether it's customers or internal operations or collaboration, before anybody else can. And then the next thing is, knowing from this research how big companies are doing this, you got a chance then to figure out how to partner better with those big companies. So number one, I think if you're a startup, know that you're faster, you've got the vision, get there first, and then second of all, use all the downsides of the people that are struggling with this to become a better partner for them.
That's great. So I wanted to maybe learn a little bit more from your framework. I know you talked about the digital masters and a little bit of the fashionistas. Mm-hmm. Could you actually walk us through the quadrant a little bit and
Sure.
understand how, just what your terminologies are and what your insight from each quadrants were?
It's interesting. We started in our first year, we interviewed 150 people in 50 companies. And we came up with this 2x2. And so if you look at the two dimensions, at the bottom side is the beginners. And the beginners, for a lot of reasons, just haven't started this. Either they just don't think they need to do it, or they're a little bit afraid. So think about a lot of companies in pharma. They've been told, or in finance for that matter, regulation is such a big, giant problem, it's kind of scary to get into it, and they use that as an excuse. Now, what our data shows is that not only are they not getting started, but these companies tend to trail in general with finance. They don't perform as well as other people. So now you move in the two dimensions. I told you about the digital masters and how they put together the digital and the leadership together. They are 26% more profitable than their industry peers. And that's pretty neat. Now, we can't tell you whether being more digital makes you more profitable or whether being more profitable, you end up doing digital this way. But it actually doesn't matter, because what this says is the best companies in the world are doing digital this way. And that's probably a good signal that you want to do it. So now the off diagonals are interesting. I told you about the fashionistas. They actually have more revenue than their peers, but not more profits. The digital allows them to get more revenue through their physical assets. And on the other side, leadership without digital, they're more profitable, but they have not as much revenue. And so in essence, they're being more efficient, but they're not using that efficiency to drive anything. So put them together. You can get revenue from fashionistas, profitability on the conservative side, put it together, you get this big bump. And that's what the digital masters do.
So I think one of the takeaway you shared here around digital, for me, it would make sense to drill down a little bit about this component of digital. Can you describe them a little more? I understand the component around leadership,
Sure.
But what are the components that you searched and asked for around digital?
So we found when we looked at what the companies are doing, that there's really three major areas they're working in. And the most visible is the customer experience side. So whether you're doing analytics to know your customers better, whether you are doing things to raise your sales, to grow the top line, or also there's some really interesting work happening now in integrating your channels and integrating customer service through digital. So Facebook self-service, online integration of the channels, these kinds of things is happening. So that's the customer side. But the internal side, I already told you about Codelco. Other interesting internal sides are people are just smarter. You've got more data. You're not guessing about next year's numbers. You actually know what that product's doing. Right? And so there's a lot of stuff, and employee collaboration, there's a lot of stuff happening there. And in business models, it's interesting. For all the talk we have about, you got to launch a brand new business model through digital, there are huge opportunities to augment, like they did at Burberry, augment your business model. And also there's just another huge opportunity. Digital's making it more possible to globalize, to act as one company than you ever could before. And some companies are getting that, and other companies are still struggling with it. So we see the customer side, the operations side, the business model side as big opportunities in general. Let me give you an example, another example though, because you were wondering. One of my favorite examples is what Caesars is doing right now. You can go into Caesars, and as you're coming down the strip going to Caesars, you can text in that you're on your way to get there. The minute you get to the Caesars Palace, instead of staying in line to get your key, the bellman already has your key. Hi, Mr. Westerman, here's your key, let me carry your bags. Now, having opted into that process, I now have opted into location-based marketing that will get me at different places in the casino. They'll sell me different kinds of coupons. And within minutes, they know whether I picked up a coupon, and they'll send me a different coupon. And I can also do mobile concierge from my phone, all this kind of stuff. But it's gotten so good now that if I leave Caesar's Palace and go down, start walking down the strip, I'll immediately start getting coupons for another Caesar's property down the way. So, hey, do you want to take a ride on the Eiffel Tower ride or something like that? It's gotten that good. And what they've done is they've taken what they've always been good at, their customer experience, their relationship-based marketing, and turned it from a cycle of 3 months to 6 months into hours. And that just helps, it makes me happier, it makes them happier. And all along, it just becomes a better experience.
So I think what you're suggesting here is that that ability to more rapidly to shorten your cycle time must somehow, it suggests it translates into a better way to compete, and that's maybe why you're seeing that difference in financial performance.
Yeah, I think so. It's really a big question. Sorry, it is a big thing. It does translate into a better way to compete if you can do it. And yet we talked to a grocery chain. I talked to the CFO of a grocery chain, and he actually told me, I've invested so much in my systems, I can't get my bleep, bleep, bleep buyers to change the way that they're buying. So my systems are doing nothing because the buyers are still doing things on their intuition based on the information they have on what's selling. It's like that story from Moneyball in baseball. It's happening in company after company where the technology is there and it's just not being used. And that's where the leadership comes in. That's where leading the change, building the skills, putting the incentives in place can make a difference between just doing the digital and actually transforming the way you work. A lot of it comes down to culture and leadership, and they go together. Because leaders can change a culture, but then the culture becomes an excuse to not lead sometimes. And so you can imagine being, an airport authority and trying to get your workers to be a little bit more customer friendly. That is a big cultural change. And yet we studied 2 airports, and one made it happen, the other didn't. The difference was really just one got led better than the other. So the culture seems to be the biggest barrier, but in many ways, that's an excuse for a failure to lead through that culture change. It is interesting. We looked across the industries, and some are moving faster than others. So you'd expect, high tech and electronics to be moving faster. Banking has moved into this, actually pretty well into this digital master space. And then you've got pharma, which is just far back because of the regulation and other things. You have manufacturing, which some manufacturers are moving quickly. Other ones are just kind of saying, my customers are not demanding it. So there are definitely these industry differences going on. But the interesting thing, we expected that sometimes in some industries you could just wait. But every industry we studied already had a digital master in it. And what's interesting about that, even pharma, even manufacturing that are slower, and what's interesting about that is that you got to think about the timing, right? If it takes 3-4 years to make this transformation, to become a digital master, that's 2 cycles of Moore's Law. So during that time you're making this change, the digital masters in your industry are just zooming ahead of you. And so we've concluded now it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you can't wait. You got to get started.
That's fascinating. Maybe one way to wrap up this section is help us understand sort of the key takeaways. I know you shared a lot of the stories, but if we wanted to walk away with the key points, perhaps maybe it's the punchline to your book, but what are the key takeaways that you'd like to leave us with?
I think the big takeaway is being digital is not enough. You really need to lead the transformation, and that's the hard part. The digital part's the fun part. The leadership is the hard part. And if you don't get that leadership right, you're not going to get the kind of benefits you need to get. There's another takeaway that we haven't talked about yet, but I think is really important, especially having written a couple books for IT, but also I know there are a lot of IT people in Thomson Reuters and in the district here and everything else. The best companies here have very strong relationships between IT and the business. So there's a temptation in a lot of companies to say IT is slow. And because it's slow, we're going to work around them. And that temptation is actually a temptation you should avoid, because there's so much knowledge in the IT staff. There's so much information in the systems that only the IT staff can manage. If you work around them, you're going to go without your information, you're going to rebuild a lot of stuff, and you're going to make the same mistakes over and over again. So one of the things we're finding is this idea of somebody needs to lead digital. It may not be your IT person, but whoever does lead digital should be working pretty closely with IT to make this change happen.
I think you had told me the story about Burberry and what Angela had done with her CIO. Can you share that again?
Yeah, so it's interesting, you hear a lot of IT people saying, if only I could be part of the conversation, that I could do great things. At Burberry, it was just the opposite. At Burberry, the CIO was not part of the conversation and either, for some reason, was not pushing too hard for it. And so Angela Ahrens recognized this. They had to redo the entire IT backbone for the company, put in a new CRM, new ERP systems. And she actually had to get with the CIO and she said, listen, I need you to get on the bus with us. Either get on the bus or get out, is kind of what she said. And to his credit, he did get on the bus, and to her credit, she helped him get on there. And because of that, they were able to really make these changes happen a lot faster than they would have if they had to replace the CIO.
Well, that's a good story, actually. Yeah. So that relationship and essentially the synergy between IT and the business and not going around IT seems to be a factor in building that leadership.
It's a huge factor because, like I said, otherwise you're reinventing or you're losing all the stuff you have. Now, IT's got to change to do this. The slow methods in IT, the innovation failures in IT, they've got to change. So you might need to have a unit where IT and business work really closely together, and while the rest of IT manages the legacy. You can do that kind of stuff. But you're better off working with them than not working with them.
All right. Well, George, thank you very much for joining us and telling us about your research, and we're looking forward to the book.
Well, thanks, Mona, for inviting me. It was fun.